In this video, I'm going to analyze the 5K runner's race data, which consists of a warm-up followed by a short rest, then a roughly 70-minute half marathon-like race effort. Before analyzing his data, the 5K runner provided some basic information about his race day routine and performance. However, we intentionally limited the amount of information he shared with me so I could analyze his data and listen to the story it was telling without bias. So, here's what I know. First, leading into the race, the 5K runner tapered optimally, allowing him to show up on race day with as high of a readiness as his current fitness level allows. However, because he's raced several other times recently, his fitness level has likely taken a slight hit from where it was prior. Now, let's talk about his race day prep. Upon wake up, the 5K runner reviewed his HRV data and saw that his HRV was below his normal range. Without further context, I won't speculate as to what this means for him. However, I will say that a decrease in HRV while tapering isn't abnormal. During intense training, an athlete's resting heart rate will often get depressed, and then during a taper, the resting heart rate could renormalize and increase, resulting in an acute decrease in heart rate variability. Okay, now let's talk about his pre-race routine. 2 hours before race time, the 5K runner supplemented with high-dose beetroot concentrate. Then 1 hour before the race time, he supplemented with an ergogenic dose of caffeine. He also supplemented with a fructose-glucose gel combination during the race in a dose-dependent fashion based on previous experience tracking with the constant glucose monitor. Finally, right before race time, the 5K runner completed his warm-up, though he specifically noted that it may have not been sufficient. Right, so now let's talk about the race. Again, the race entails a 70-minute half marathon-like effort. We also know the course was largely flat. The 5K runner was kind enough to share his stride power data with me, and the first thing that jumped out was that he came out pretty hot and started falling off his pace about 30 minutes into the race. His power then progressively declines through the remainder. I could also see a similar pattern in his heart rate data. Within the first few minutes, his heart rate went from the low 80 beats per minute to around 140 beats per minute before climbing into the mid 160s. Then around that 30-minute mark, when power starts trailing off, his heart rate progressively declines as power output falls. Right, so now I'm going to review the data collected with the Nox wearable worn on the 5K runner's left quadricep, and I'll analyze that data in Nox's web-based high-performance platform. My analysis will be broken into 4 parts. The what? This is where I review his accelerometer and biomarker data is captured with the Nox wearable, and then perform a descriptive analysis of his data, which is a straightforward telling of what went on in his body physiologically during his race. The second part is the why. This is where I contextualize the 5K runner's internal physiologic data against external measurements of load to explain why we are observing the aforementioned biomarker trends and what they mean from a practical perspective. The third part is the how. This is where I identify the 5K runner's physiologic limitation while he was racing and provide feedback as to how he could improve his performance. And finally, I'll explain how the 5K runner could use his Nox data to track changes in fitness, physiology, and efficiency over time. Okay, so let's start with the what. First, let's look at the 5K runner's accelerometer data. We could clearly see the start of the race around 30 minutes into the dataset, which is marked by this big burst in power output. Now, if we zoom in and pay attention, we could see this slight progressive decline in the accelerometer data across the race, which conforms with the power data that the 5K runner collected and was kind enough to share with me. Now, let's layer on his muscle oxygenation data. Remember, muscle oxygenation, or SMO2, reflects the balance of oxygen supply and demand in the working muscles. An increasing muscle oxygenation trend means oxygen is supplied at a greater rate than it's utilized in the muscles, and a decreasing muscle oxygenation trend means oxygen demand is greater than supply. If we zoom in, we could see that right out of the gate, there's a simultaneous increase in his power and a decrease in his muscle oxygenation, indicating a high exertion state. Now, after about 10 minutes of progressively declining muscle oxygenation, we then see it start to progressively increase, which is likely due to the 5K runner being better warmed up and getting into a good rhythm as he runs. This slight upward trend in oxygenation values lasts until around the 30-minute mark into the race when the 5K runner reported hitting a wall, and from there to the end of the race, we start to see a progressive downward muscle oxygenation trend as he fatigues, and you could see that right across here. Now, let's view the 5K runner's muscle oxygenation and nitric oxide measurements together. Most athletes have at least passing familiarity with nitric oxide, but often don't realize that there are many different forms of nitric oxide in the body, and their function depends on their source. NOx specifically measures the form of nitric oxide, called snow hemoglobin, released from red blood cells as they pass through small blood vessels in deoxygenated tissues. This form of nitric oxide is the primary regulator of blood flow and oxygen delivery to the brain, the heart, and exercising muscles. Upon the start of the race, we see this rapid drop in muscle oxygenation corresponding with a sharp rise in nitric oxide, which indicates increasing blood flow and oxygen delivery to the exercising muscles. Now, nitric oxide is released in response to hypoxia, so as the 5K runner's muscle oxygenation increases, his nitric oxide level progressively declines, which we could see in this section on screen. Simply put, there's less of a need to increase blood flow that supplies oxygen to the tissue. Finally, around that 30-minute mark into the race, we again see a progressive rise in nitric oxide through the duration, which is clearly needed to support the 5K runner's efforts. Notably, though, we see this nitric oxide level plateau in the last 10 minutes of the race, which is something I'll come back to later. So, we've now reviewed the 5K runner's biomarker data and should have a clear understanding of what's happening on a physiologic level during his race. But now let's zoom in and talk about the why. In other words, what this all means from a practical perspective. In order to do this, we'll break the race down into 3 parts, each with a distinct biological fingerprint. The first part is this first roughly 10 minutes of the race. During this portion, we saw a rapid increase in his power output, which is reflected in this accelerometer data. And we also see a simultaneous decrease in muscle oxygenation and increase in nitric oxide. Now, these trends indicate a high exertion period where oxygen supply is less than oxygen demand, followed by a period of increasing fatigue without changing power output. Part 2 is the next roughly 20 minutes of the race. So during this portion, we continue to see a relatively stable power output, but now muscle oxygenation is starting to increase while nitric oxide levels start to decline. Now, this means that the balance of oxygen supply and demand has shifted to favoring oxygen supply. This is likely due to the 5K runner being better warmed up, in addition to his synchronization improving, allowing for a more favorable muscle recruitment pattern and increased efficiency. Now, part 3 of the workout includes the last roughly 40 minutes of the race after the 5K runner starts to hit a wall and fall off his pace. During this portion, we see the progressive decline in muscle oxygenation and increase in nitric oxide. These trends show that the 5K runner's performance is progressively decreasing as he fatigues, and then in the final 10 minutes of the race, we see his nitric oxide levels start to plateau. At this point, he could no longer cope with the physiological demand by increasing blood flow and oxygen delivery to tissues, resulting in increased fatigue and perceived exertion, which conforms with the feedback that the 5K runner gave me, which is that he pushed to about a 98 to 99% effort in this race. So, now that we've covered the what and the why, let's talk about the how. Specifically, how could the 5K runner improve his future performance by identifying his physiological limitation and training to remediate it? A physiological limitation is a rate-limiting factor for improving an individual's VO2 max, which we could think of as the maximal integrated capacity of the pulmonary, cardiovascular, and muscular system to uptake, transport, and utilize oxygen respectively. In each individual, one of these three systems will act as a rate-limiting factor, and by identifying it, we could provide more targeted training. Now, to identify a physiological limitation, the first thing I look at is the muscle oxygenation trend. If you notice on screen, we see this progressive decline in muscle oxygenation from around the 30-minute mark until the end of the race. And to me, this means we could already rule out a muscle oxidative capacity or utilization limitation. If the muscular system is limiting performance, we tend to see little to no change in muscle oxygenation when someone transitions from a sustainable to an unsustainable pace. Now, we know that from 30 minutes onward, the 5K runner was progressively fatiguing. We could also see a steady decline in muscle oxygenation from there to the end of the event, ruling out a utilization limitation. Now, the next thing I look at is the nitric oxide trend. In pulmonary or respiratory limited athletes, we expect to see nitric oxide levels increasing up to the point of momentary muscular failure. However, in a cardiovascular or delivery limited athlete, we expect to see nitric oxide levels plateauing about 5 to 10 minutes prior to task failure. Looking at the 5K runners' data, it appears to line up with the later. If we only had these two data points to go off of, that would be my best interpretation of a limiter. Now, we also have the 5K runners' heart rate data. As I previously mentioned, we saw the 5K runner's heart rate progressively increase for around 30 minutes, then decline slightly in the back half of the race. This is a more common pattern in delivery limited athletes, whereas we'd expect for respiratory or pulmonary limited athletes to increase their heart rate up to the point of failure in an event. Interestingly, these fingerprints of a delivery limitation also conform with the little bit I know about the 5K runner's strength and weakness. For example, he excels more in shorter races like a 5K and struggles much more with longer events like an Ironman. This explains why. Now, the question is how to improve a delivery limitation outside of the obvious like higher volumes of zone 2 training and the like, which is necessary but not sufficient for this type of limiter. The short answer is that we want to improve his maximal cardiac output, and one way to do this would be with something called gradual desaturation training, which provides a nice bang for the buck. When you begin intense exercise, your skeletal muscles' demand for oxygen exceeds the cardiovascular system's ability to supply oxygen to the working muscles, and as a result, muscle oxygenation levels decline, like we see on screen here. When oxygen levels in a muscle decrease, nitric oxide is released from red blood cells passing through the muscle, and this signals for the small blood vessels to dilate, increasing muscle blood flow and oxygen delivery. And this process is called the autoregulation of blood flow. Well, why does skeletal muscle vasodilation warrant an increase in cardiac output? Well, when your small blood vessels dilate, the heart needs to pump harder and faster to maintain blood pressure. Otherwise, you'd black out. And you could think of it like this. What would happen if you increased the diameter of the water pipes in your house without your water pump pumping harder? No water would come out of your faucet because your water pressure would be too low. Your body works in a similar way. When blood vessels dilate, your heart has to pump harder and faster to maintain your blood pressure. Otherwise, you wouldn't get enough blood to your brain, heart, and muscles. Now, since the circulatory system is a big closed loop, any blood pumped out from the heart also has to return back to the heart. The increase in the blood volume coming back to the heart will stretch the heart, causing the ventricles to fill with more blood and eject more blood with each beat. And this is known as the Frank-Starling law, which states that the more you stretch the heart muscle cells, the harder the heart contracts and the more blood it ejects. In a healthy athlete, this results in improved cardiac contractility, stroke volume, and cardiac output over time. Now, interestingly, the circulatory system is self-regulating. The brain's only going to let you dilate your blood vessels to the exercising muscles to the extent that your heart could increase its output and keep your blood pressure from falling. There's a range of exercise intensities that are optimal for improving your cardiac output. Nox could help you identify that in real time. So, as we said earlier, muscle oxygenation declines more and more as exercise intensity increases in a delivery limited athlete, and nitric oxide levels rise. But past a given intensity threshold, nitric oxide levels rise more slowly or cease to increase further, as we could demonstrate in the last portion of the race here. Now, suppose your goal is to improve your cardiac output efficiently. In that case, you should train below that intensity threshold and maximize training time spent there while still being mindful of your power output, exertion level, and fatigue. One of the best ways to do that is with gradual desaturation training. To perform gradual desaturation training, you should progressively deoxygenate your exercising muscles to a minimum muscle oxygenation value, resulting in nitric oxide levels reaching their peak concentration. During these workouts, your heart will progressively pump harder and faster up to its tolerable limit, and at that point you'll achieve peak cardiac output levels. Once your muscle oxygenation level is no longer declining and your nitric oxide levels are no longer increasing, you should cut your work interval short. Now, I recommend aiming for anywhere from 2 to 6 minute work intervals, and you could repeat this process 3 to 6 times in a workout, resting maybe 3 to 5 minutes between sets. You could almost think of these intervals like a 30-minute tempo run scrunched down into like a 5 to 6 minute period. Similar idea where you're gradually increasing pace across. Now, let's say the 5K runner trains and meaningfully increases his fitness. The next question is, how should we know? Well, the obvious answer is that his race times get faster, but I think we could do better than that. For example, we could track how much the 5K runner deoxygenates his muscles at a given exercise intensity over time, and if he's deoxygenating less at a given power output, we know he's improved his fitness and efficiency. In this way, every training session could serve as an assessment. Additionally, in future races, we could continue to identify the 5K runner's physiological limitations, so after a race, he not only knows if he's improved his performance, he could also walk away with actionable information as to what he should do to keep improving.